Another day, another update in NASCAR. Here's the latest in the lawsuit Joe Gibbs Racing filed against former JGR competition director Chris Gabehart and Spire Motorsports. I'm Jordan Bianchi for Dirty Mo Media and The Athletic. And before we dive into the details, just a reminder, this lawsuit stems from allegations that JGR says Chris Gabehart embarked on a brazen scheme to steal JGR's most sensitive information and use it for the benefit of a direct competitor in NASCAR, Spire Motorsports. Heavy, serious allegations levied against Chris Gabehart. So not surprising that yesterday Chris Gabehart came out swinging in his official filing to JGR's lawsuit against him. But before we dive into what you need to know about what Gabehart said in his filing yesterday, and it's a lot, I want to spotlight a sentence that is buried towards the bottom of his declaration, but really is the overarching theme for why Gabehart feels JGR is suing him. Here is what Gabehart says. This lawsuit is not about protecting trade secrets. It is about punishing a former employee for daring to leave. This lawsuit is not about protecting trade secrets. It is about punishing a former employee for daring to leave. Keep that in mind as we go through this year, and you're going to probably see why Gabehart feels this way. And again, this is Gabehart's side of the story, not JGR's. We have gone over JGR's side of the story. You can look at those previous videos for that. So let's dive into it. One of the main issues in this is a breach of contract, and that JGR says Chris Gabehart did not fulfill his duties. He is in violation of that. He needs to sit out for a period of time. Before he joined Spire Motorsports, he stole confidential information, that kind of thing. Here is what Chris Gabehart said about that breach of contract. He is going to demonstrate that JGR materially breached the terms of his employment agreement by withholding payment to him, voiding all rights to enforce any non-compete obligation. What Gabehart is saying is that he followed the steps in his contract to express his displeasure with how he felt his job was going and the duties that were being limited, and that he expressed that to JGR as written in his contract. And here's some of the interesting things about that contract that he lays out. The second paragraph of section 9(6) provides that the non-compete period is reduced to 1 week, and JGR must pay Gabehart $100,000 in exchange for a complete mutual release if after September 1st, 2025, and before June 1st, 2026, JGR is the specific job duties or responsibilities assigned to him are inconsistent with reasonable expectations that he has or the job description that was provided to him before he took his role as competition director. So that is September 1st, 2025 and June 1st, 2026. And keep those dates in mind because really the issue here centers around conversations and events that started happening in November. So well before that June 1st, 2026 deadline. And remember, Gabehart gave his notice to JGR, or they agreed to a mutual separation, depending on how you look at it, that he was leaving the organization in mid-November. So well within that time frame. And so, remember, he met with Joe Gibbs Racing in early November to discuss his future. Gabehart came away from that meeting deciding that, hey, this isn't working out for me, and that he needs to leave. And here's why Gabehart says he was dissatisfied with Joe Gibbs Racing and his role as competition director. During the 2025 season, Gabehart became dissatisfied with certain responsibilities in his position as competition director and other aspects of how JGR's race teams were being run that were not in accord with the contract that he signed. He says that he provided notice of this to JGR throughout the course of the 2025 season. He goes into, on or around November 6, 2025, Gabehart provided written notice to JGR in accordance with his contract, and that responsibilities assigned to him that were materially inconsistent with reasonable expectations for what he expected the position of Cup Series competition director to be, and that it was as the job was described to him by Joe Gibbs Racing and team co-owner Joe Gibbs prior to taking that job. Gabehart says he notified JGR the job was not at all as advertised. He was promised a COO type role overseeing all competitive operations with autonomy to lead. Instead, though, he found himself consistently intertwined with Coach Gibbs, senior JGR executives and family members. Let's keep in mind as we go on here, Heather Gibbs is Coach Gibbs's daughter-in-law, the mother of Ty Gibbs, and she is also a co-owner of the team. So she would apply to both being a senior JGR executive and a family member. Gabehart goes on, when making even routine competition decisions, basically the executives were interjecting themselves in decisions that were supposed to be under his realm, and he was trying to lead the competition side of things, but those above him were not allowing him to operate as he best saw fit. He says that JGR has a dysfunctional organizational structure that he could not continue in, which is why he gave notice. And now we move on to some of the more spicy details of things, and we're going to break this down a little bit here in a minute. Gabehart says, I further expressed serious concerns about the management of JGR's number 54 car, which is one of the 4 Sprint Cup Series teams that JGR enters. It was Gabehart's view that the number 54 car should be managed and held accountable in the same manner as the organization's other cars. Instead, the number 54 car was managed directly by Coach Gibbs, and everyone in the organization knew it. What Gabehart is saying here is that instead of having control or overseeing all 4 Cup Series cars and directing them and leading them and how he best sees fit, basically Gabehart was given the 3 cars. Christopher Bell, Chase Briscoe, and Denny Hamlin's teams, but Ty Gibbs, and interestingly a note, Gabehart never actually mentions Ty Gibbs by name in this lawsuit, but the 54 car was not under his guidance, but instead that was overseen by team owner Coach Gibbs, and that interfered with how Chris Gabehart wanted to lead the organization. Gabehart goes on. Beginning early in the 2025 season, Coach Gibbs repeatedly pressured me to take over as crew chief of the number 54 car. I consistently declined, explaining that as competition director, I did not believe this was the right move and that it would undermine the long-term development of the team, and I did not want to be crew chief of the number 54 or any other car. Despite my objections, Coach Gibbs and ownership continued pressing, and I eventually conceded to the pressure by first helping the number 54 team more behind the scenes, and then, beginning on June 28, 2025, by publicly serving as crew chief and calling the races on Sunday for 9 consecutive races. Go back to last summer, Gabehart's first race atop the pit box of the 54, I believe, was Atlanta, and then he was, of course, kind of managing that team throughout the summer. The role, as was described then publicly anyway, was his more like a chief strategist, and he was kind of helping with strategy calls on Sunday and not involved in the day-to-day, if you will. But this does read that he was certainly more involved on a crew chief level than it seemed to be believed. And it's also a role that he didn't want to be in. He did not want to be crew chief. Again, he wanted to be solely a competition director and did not want to lead one specific car on a day-to-day basis. But as he says, he felt pressured by the team to do so, so he did take over leading that team for a stretch of races last year. Gabehart goes on to say, I identified specific examples of the number 54 team's differential treatment that undermined my position as competition director. Note, for example, key personnel decisions were made without my counsel or input despite my role as competition director. And critically, the number 54 driver, he does not actually name Ty Gibbs' name, was not held to the same meeting attendance standards as others on the team. So let's take a pause here for a second. And we've heard a lot of discourse the last few months and really going back to last year about how Joe Gibbs Racing manages Ty Gibbs. If Ty Gibbs has different expectations and different standards that he's held to within the organization. There's been a lot of people in the garage that have whispered about this, that have talked about this. There's been a presumption that Ty Gibbs is held to a different standard, but no one would really ever say anything publicly. And then when people would ask on the record, they would say no, like he is held to the same standards as the other drivers. But here's somebody that was intricately involved with Joe Gibbs Racing, who obviously was involved with the 54 team on a very hands-on basis, saying that the 54 team is, one, managed very differently from the other 3 Sprint Cup cars, and 2, the driver of the 54 car was not being held to the same standards as Christopher Bell, as a Denny Hamlin, or a Chase Briscoe, and specifically meeting attendance standards basically saying he's not showing up or not attending regular meetings and presumably competition meetings with the team. So that's probably the most juicy part of this, and that's going to get a lot of headlines and everything, because this is certainly noteworthy about this and something that a lot of people have whispered about and spoken a little bit about over the years, but really is now kind of starting to bubble up a little bit. Another interesting thing that Gabehart talks about and he acknowledges is taking photos of information within Joe Gibbs's systems, if you will. One of the allegations levied against Chris Gabehart by Joe Gibbs Racing is that he took photos and copied files of proprietary information that Joe Gibbs Racing has and put it onto a third-party drive, and presumably to take with him to wherever he was going next or to share with that team or whatever. That Joe Gibbs Racing says is against their guidelines, and that Gabehart knew this. And Gabehart says that he admits that on November 7th, 2025, he took photos on his phone of a JGR Excel file with multiple tabs and other notes and files that he created. But he says that he created the information that he was taking photos of, the files, setups, whatnot, right? He is saying that he helped either create them or he created them solely, and they had a significant role in their development. So he is saying that he essentially feels like he has ownership of this. And then he also goes on to say all of the information contained within the files was relevant to my job at JGR. And he stresses this: I understood my confidentiality obligations to JGR and had no intent to violate these obligations with respect to JGR's confidential or trade secret information. I did not plan to use any such information in future employment and have not done so. This is a counter argument to JGR saying he went in, took all this information, put it onto a third-party system, and had intent to take it with him to wherever he was going, which would be Spire Motorsports. Gabehart's declaration goes on to talk about the contentiousness and that he felt within Joe Gibbs Racing, specifically in November. There, he had that meeting with Joe Gibbs on November 6th. They agreed in that meeting to part ways. Joe Gibbs has acknowledged in a Sirius XM radio interview Joe Gibbs did with myself and Daniel Trotta. Joe Gibbs said, we had a meeting at the end of the year and we mutually agreed to part ways. That is actually mentioned in Gabehart's declaration as well. Gabehart says on November 10th, 2025, the following parties begin working on terms of a separation agreement. And then JGR placed him on gardening leave. You heard me mention gardening leave yesterday. Basically what this is when an employee is leaving and they're under contract, they are basically kind of pushed off to the side. You're no longer allowed to be at the shop. You're no longer to work on things. And you kind of have to sit on the sidelines for a defined period of time until that certain time frame is exercised. And so Gabehart says that JGR placed him on gardening leave while he worked through a separation agreement, and that JGR instructed him that if anyone asked internally within Joe Gibbs Racing about where he was, he should just tell them that he's on vacation. On November 8th, 2025, Gabehart had communication with Tim Carmichael, which is Joe Gibbs Racing Chief Financial Officer, and that Carmichael indicated to Chris Gabehart that he did not blame Gabehart for exercising the rights within his contract, and that the role that Gabehart was in was not actually the role that he was promised, and it was as it was defined, and it had become something else other than that, lesser than what Gabehart believed. Another thing that has been prominently discussed in this is the Spire folders that were found on Gabehart's computer. Gabehart addresses that. He says that he created a folder on his Google Drive named Spire that he used as his personal working space to evaluate the job offer and consider his options. Spire, he says, came to him on late November 13th, and offered him a job within that company. He says that he had been looking into the company, and as he was gathering information about them and whether to go work there or not, he was putting this information in a folder named Spire. And that job offer came on November 13th, 2025, and then he received an unsolicited job offer from Spire. That job offer became Chief Motorsports officer, which is a little bit of point of contention because Joe Gibbs Racing says that chief motorsports officer is essentially the same thing as competition director and that their duties are one and the same. Gabehart and Spire say that is not true. It's a completely different role. This is more the chief motorsports officer is a higher level, and that he has more decision making. And then, as he said, like it's a COO type job, whereas Joe Gibbs Racing it was not, and that he was promised that kind of deal, but it never actually materialized. Another point of contention in all this has been third-party forensics and what they found or didn't find on Gabehart's Google Drive, phones, etc. He goes into that. He says that he signed a sworn declaration under penalty of perjury certifying that he had conducted a reasonable search of his files and the only confidential JGR information that he had in his possession from his employment with JGR was located on his Google Drive and personal cell phone, and he had returned that and turned that in. He also certified under penalty of perjury that since November 1st, 2025, he had not transferred confidential information belonging to JGR to any third party, nor had he intentionally allowed any third party to view any confidential information belonging to Joe Gibbs Racing. So he is saying that he had all of this information that he was privy to, and he had, maybe copied onto a file, setups, documents, that kind of thing. He says he wasn't sharing that with Spire Motorsports. He was keeping that for himself because we went over that. He says that he was involved in that heavily, or that it was stuff he came up with on his own, and he was not actually sharing that with Joe Gibbs Racing. And then he goes on to say the third-party forensic analysis confirmed what Gabehart had maintained from the outset. There is no evidence that Gabehart transmitted, distributed, used, or otherwise shared any JGR confidential information. There was no text messages, no email attachments, no dissemination whatsoever. A January 21st, 2026 email from the forensic examiner confirmed that he did not locate that the examiner did not locate any text messages or email attachments with the files that JGR had previously identified as being of interest. After this third-party forensic analysis was done, Gabehart says that JGR indicated it was still not satisfied, and that to further satisfy Joe Gibbs Racing, Gabehart said that Spire Motorsports was willing to allow a neutral forensic examiner under a mutually agreed protocol to review Spire's own materials solely to confirm that no JGR information had been transmitted to or used by Spire. Basically, what this is saying is that the information that Gabehart had, he had not shared with Spire Motorsports. So Spire Motorsports had no knowledge of it, had no access to it, and they were willing, both Spire and Gabehart were willing to consent to a third-party forensic analysis examination to show that, hey, this information is being protected as Gabehart said it was, and Spire has no access to it. Gabehart says that JGR never responded to this offer. Instead, Joe Gibbs Racing filed the lawsuit against him last week, and that Joe Gibbs Racing chose litigation and public spectacle over the verification it claimed to seek. Here we are. Where are we at right now? Well, this is Thursday, tomorrow is Friday, and tomorrow a hearing is scheduled in downtown Charlotte at the courthouse we know and love so well, the federal courthouse where Front Row Motorsports, 2311 Racing and NASCAR spent many weeks over the past year and a half. And guess what? We'll be there again tomorrow as JGR's request for a temporary restraining order to prevent Gabehart from working at Spire is going to be heard, but before a judge. Stay tuned. I am Jordan Bianchi from The Athletic, and as this case continues, and certainly more updates will come, we will have updates continually here on Dirty Mo Overdrive.